The question of Russia's stability has moved beyond the realm of external threats and into a critical internal crisis. We are confronting the chilling reality that the most significant danger to the Russian state is now recognized by its own architects, the impending societal collapse. This is not an assessment from a foreign adversary. It is the core diagnosis delivered by the Kremlin itself, confirming that Putin's war has become the primary mechanism for the country's self-destruction. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare, global affairs, and US domestic politics. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. Also, please watch this video to the very end, even if you play it in the background without sound, as your continuous viewing is critical to help promote the truth about the war. The evidence for this structural failure comes from a remarkable and rare public admission. A high-ranking official within the Putin administration, in a programmatic article published in a state journal, explicitly identified societal fracture and internal conflict as the #1 challenge to the very existence of Russian civilization. This is a confession that the threat of a time of troubles or even civil war is the leadership's greatest fear. This stark honesty proves that the propaganda narrative of unity and patriotic consolidation is a desperate, failing lie. The catalyst for this disintegration is the war in Ukraine. Putin launched the aggression under the pretense of restoring order and saving Russia's sovereignty. Yet the war has achieved the precise opposite. Instead of consolidating the populace, the conflict has acted as a catalyst, magnifying every pre-existing fault line within the country. The war has brutally divided society into those who enthusiastically support the military operation and those who secretly or openly oppose it, fracturing families and friendships. The uneven distribution of the burden of war, where sons from poor national regions like Dagestan and Buryatia die on the front line, while the elite in Moscow remain untouched, has inflamed long-standing social and economic grievances. The military failure and the subsequent loss of trust in official reports have fueled an open conflict even within the patriotic base itself, pitting generals against political figures and militarist bloggers against the security services. This catastrophic division confirms that the political system's stability, which was built on the shaky foundation of perceived control and oil wealth, has been fatally undermined. The war has forced these fractures to the surface, accelerating a process of internal decay that the current leadership is neither willing nor able to manage. By identifying the risk of internal conflict as the primary danger, the Kremlin is admitting that its most powerful act, the invasion of Ukraine, is the very force that is now guaranteeing its own systemic destruction.
We have analyzed the Kremlin's shocking confession regarding internal social collapse. Now, we must dissect the proposed cure, a tragic display of leadership failure where ideology is being cynically deployed to substitute for political and economic strategy. Faced with systemic structural decay, the regime's solution is not reform, but an intense, total commitment to a fictional, constructed reality. The problem is fundamentally one of intellectual bankruptcy. The ruling elite has identified the massive cracks in the foundation, the impending social strife, the collapse of trust, and the demographic decline. Yet it offers absolutely no concrete, measurable solutions. Instead of proposing economic policies to curb the skyrocketing inflation or implementing political reforms to tackle corruption and inefficiency, the response is a total commitment, plastering over the cracks with ideology. This is a conscious pivot to a new, extreme catechism of control. The official ideologists are pushing for a total embrace of abstract concepts, spiritual bonds, traditional values, and the construction of a new Soviet Man 2.0, a model of the perfect citizen. This citizen must be defined by active patriotism, self-sacrifice, and family and traditional morality. The message is clear. You, the people, must be ready to endure poverty, suffer, and die without complaint for the sake of the higher, sacred goal articulated by the leadership. This ideological frenzy is a clear public acknowledgement of the regime's weakness. The emphasis on moral purification and traditionalism is the last refuge of a state that has failed at every other level of governance. When the financial system is failing, when the economy is contracting, and when the demographic future is being consumed by emigration and war casualties, the leadership can no longer appeal to material success. It must desperately cling to abstract, non-verifiable values. The proposed solutions are absurdly divorced from reality. The ideologists suggest that the massive demographic collapse, which is directly caused by the war consuming young men's lives and driving hundreds of thousands of educated citizens into exile, can be solved by banning movies that show families with fewer than 3 children. They claim that the structural loss of sovereignty can be reversed by simply teaching more patriotism in schools. This intellectual and political failure confirms that the regime is living in a state of terminal denial, where propaganda has entirely replaced pragmatic strategy. This desperate ideological plastering guarantees that the structural issues, the economic corruption, the lack of meritocracy, and the military incompetence will remain unaddressed, ensuring the accelerated collapse of the entire system.
We have analyzed the failure of political strategy and the ideological decay consuming the Russian regime. Now, we confront the third, most volatile consequence of the war: the explosion of internal conflicts that is pitting the elites against each other and the regions against the center. This is a triple strike of military, economic, and ethnic resentment that places the entire federation on the brink of chaos. The war, far from uniting the ruling class, has dramatically accelerated the fracture of the elites. The veneer of unified control, so carefully constructed by Putin, was violently torn away by the Prigozhin mutiny in 2023. That armed march on Moscow, which Putin himself characterized as verging on civil war, confirmed that the loyalty of the security services and regional actors is purely conditional. Following that event, the War of the Towers intensified. Generals perceived as disloyal were quietly purged. The heads of competing security services engaged in bitter power struggles, and military commanders were arrested. This constant cycle of silent purges confirms that the ruling elite is deeply fractured and consumed by mutual suspicion, ensuring that the central government is structurally incapable of mounting a unified, effective defense against external or internal threats. This elite struggle intersects catastrophically with deep national and ethnic resentments. The war has exposed an undeniable economic and demographic inequality that fuels widespread anger on the periphery. The vast majority of the soldiers who are dying on the front lines are drawn from the poorest national republics, regions like Dagestan and Buryatia. These regions are paying a disproportionate cost in blood, while the population of Moscow and St. Petersburg remains largely insulated from the draft and the daily care of the fighting. This unfair burden has inflamed long-standing ethnic grievances, with early protests in these republics questioning why their sons must die for Moscow's ambitions. This deep sense of being exploited accelerates the nationalistic resentment toward the central authority. This feeling of being sacrificed is compounded by the political anomaly of regions like Chechnya. Putin chose to buy the loyalty of the Chechen meter by granting the republic a uniquely privileged status, funding it with astronomical federal subsidies, billions of dollars annually that dwarf the budgets of other regions. This economic and political exceptionalism is a permanent source of nationalist resentment among the general Russian populace, who see the massive subsidy as an unearned tax on the federal budget.
The leader's refusal to impose the rule of law on Chechnya, allowing its leader to run the republic as a personal fiefdom, confirms to the rest of the Federation that the center is weak and governed by cronyism, not constitution. This structural unfairness creates the perfect combustible mix of economic grievance, ethnic resentment, and military betrayal, ensuring that any major disruption to central power will likely lead to regional and internal conflict, exactly what the Kremlin official identified as the greatest threat to Russia's future.
We have analyzed the political fractures and the collapse of the elites. Now we confront the most immediate and terrifying domestic threat to Russia's future, the wholesale militarization of society, which is actively creating a powder keg of armed, traumatized individuals poised for internal conflict. This is a deliberate yet ultimately self-destructive consequence of Putin's war. The core problem is the mass dissemination of lethal violence and weapons across the entire social structure. The war has normalized the flow of combat-grade weaponry into civilian life, both through official channels and illicit ones. Simultaneously, the state has relied heavily on recruiting convicted criminals and violent felons to fill the ranks. These individuals, who have been pardoned for their crimes in exchange for service, are now returning to civilian life with combat experience and a proven disregard for the law. This fusion of trained violence and organized crime is a direct contaminant to the internal security of the state. The greatest danger, however, lies in the human cost of the conflict. Hundreds of thousands of men are cycling through the intense, brutal violence of the front lines, a conflict defined by artillery bombardment and FPV drone strikes. These returning veterans are suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, emotional trauma, and a complete, agonizing inability to reintegrate into the rigid, failing civilian economy. The state, which is failing to provide adequate medical, psychological, and social support for these veterans, is actively creating a vast pool of armed, volatile, and deeply disillusioned men. Historically, the return of large numbers of traumatized armed veterans into a society experiencing economic stagnation and political instability is the classic precursor to armed insurgency and civil conflict. The returning troops, often feeling betrayed by a leadership that failed to reward their sacrifice, seek retribution and purpose. The high likelihood of unemployment, coupled with the normalized use of extreme violence, means that these individuals will inevitably be drawn into organized crime, vigilantism, and paramilitary activity. The eventual formation of armed gangs and veteran detachments fighting for resources or political power becomes a statistically high probability. This is the ultimate ticking time bomb for the Russian state. The ongoing war is not just destroying Ukraine, it is creating the internal human infrastructure for future armed insurgency and a bloody interregional struggle. This process guarantees that any future social or economic crisis, the inevitable result of the failing budget, will escalate instantly from a political protest into a violent armed confrontation, confirming that the seeds of civil war have been sown by the state itself. We have meticulously analyzed the structural weaknesses consuming the Russian state, the elite infighting, the economic insolvency, and the terror of the returning veterans. The final, chilling verdict on this era of rule is that Vladimir Putin, in his desperate attempt to prevent the collapse of the Russian Federation, has become the single greatest force accelerating its destruction. His entire political project, which began with the promise of stability, is now destined to end in civil war and structural disintegration. The deep irony of this outcome is rooted in the leader's own fear. For decades, Putin justified his dictatorship control, his suppression of media, and his destruction of democratic institutions by invoking the single greatest national trauma: the threat of chaos, internal strife,
and the collapse of the nation. Yet his ultimate act of stabilization, the invasion of Ukraine, has acted as a profound, self-fulfilling prophecy. The war has catastrophically magnified every single fault line the system was struggling to contain. Economic inequality, ethnic resentment, and the schism among the security elites. The crucial mechanism ensuring this catastrophic outcome is the absence of legitimate institutions for political transition. Putin systematically eliminated all legal means of transferring power. The courts are corrupted, the elections are meaningless, and the opposition is either dead or in exile. This centralization of all authority on one figure has created a profound structural fragility. The moment the leader's personal power falters, whether due to health, military failure, or political defeat, the entire vertical of power will collapse like a house of cards. There is no constitutional safety valve, no mechanism for a peaceful transfer of power. This institutional failure is colliding with a volatile social reality, a militarized and traumatized society. The mass recruitment of convicts and the return of hundreds of thousands of combat-hardened veterans, coupled with the systemic failure of the state to provide them with economic reintegration or psychological care, has armed the most dangerous elements of society. The final catalyst for a new smuta will be the breakdown of the economy, the inevitable moment when the state can no longer pay the salaries and the pensions it promised. When the political vacuum at the center meets a desperate, armed, and disillusioned periphery, the transition from political crisis to full-scale civil conflict is virtually guaranteed. The leader's legacy, therefore, is not the eternal Russia he sought to build, but a nation driven by his own paranoia toward a violent future. He will be remembered not as a uniting czar, but as the primary architect of a strategic failure that led directly to the disintegration of the state.